I was 60 years old when my kids sold my house without telling me. They simply sat me down at the dining table with lit candles and an open bottle of wine like it was some kind of celebration and announced I had a month to move out. They laughed. All of them laughed, even my sons-in-law, who looked down at their plates with that poorly disguised smile of someone who already knows how the movie ends. What none of them knew was that I knew every single cent of that sale, because I was the one who bought it. But before I continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. There's a weird thing that happens when you get older and still believe that family is the safest place in the world. You start letting little things slide. A passive-aggressive comment here, an absence there, an excuse that arrives just a little too late. And you keep bottling those things up behind a smile because you're a mother, because you're a grandmother, because you learned early on that holding on to grudges is bad for your blood pressure, your heart, your sleep. You learn to swallow it, and you keep swallowing it until the day you just can't anymore. My name is Margaret. I'm 60 years old. I've worked as a CPA for over 35 years, and I raised 2 kids practically on my own after my husband died way too young. Richard was 42 when his heart just gave out. It was a Friday morning, and I was in the kitchen making a pot of coffee when the phone rang. Friday mornings were never normal for me again. Even today, every Friday morning, there is a split second right before the coffee finishes brewing, where I stand still, looking at the steam rising, and I think of him. I raised Matthew and Stephanie the best way I could. I gave them what I had, and sometimes what I didn't have. I worked 2 jobs for years. I slept little, ate leftovers, and wore my clothes until they were threadbare. I had this one blue blouse that I wore for almost a decade because I simply wouldn't give myself permission to buy a new one. There was always a more urgent bill to pay, new school shoes Matthew needed, or a field trip Stephanie wanted to go on that I didn't want her to miss. I don't regret any of that. What I do regret is not noticing sooner what they were building inside themselves as they grew up. Matthew took after his father, serious, calculating, always with a mental spreadsheet running in his head. Ever since he was a little boy, he'd organize his toys by category, make lists before leaving the house, and never spend his allowance before the last day of the month. He became an accountant too, just like me, which in practice meant we had 2 adults in the same house who knew exactly how much every decision cost, especially the wrong ones. Stephanie developed a personality I could never quite figure out where she got it from. A gentle coldness, you know. The kind of person who smiles while saying something that cuts deep, who chooses her words carefully, not to avoid hurting you, but to make sure you can't clearly pinpoint the exact moment you were hurt. When they grew up, they both got married, built their own lives, and I continued being that ever-present mother. I went to the grandkids' birthdays, helped out whenever they needed, and listened to both of their problems as if I didn't have any of my own. The house I lived in was the same as always. The same house in suburban Ohio, where the 2 of them grew up, where Richard lived, where I planted the hydrangea bushes he loved so much in the backyard. A simple, split-level home in a quiet neighborhood, with big windows and a long hallway that echoed when someone walked barefoot in the winter. It was too small to be considered a massive estate, but way too big to be ignored when the real estate market skyrocketed in a way nobody in the area had predicted. Suddenly, houses that were worth just enough for a normal, middle-class life were suddenly worth enough to make heirs start getting restless. That's when it all started. Over the last 2 years, Matthew and Stephanie had started bringing up the house with a frequency I didn't quite understand. Random comments dropped in the middle of other conversations, planted with that breezy tone of someone pretending they're just thinking out loud. "Mom, you know this neighborhood's property values have gone through the roof, right? Mom, you're living all alone in this huge house. Don't you think it's a bit of a waste? Mom, we're just thinking about your future." I would listen, nod my head, and change the subject. I didn't want to get into fights. The pressure was building up like water, slowly heating in a pot. You only realize it's boiling when it's already too late. On that Thursday night, Matthew called me saying he wanted to have a family dinner. He said it was to talk about some important things, and that I really should be there. I went. Of course I went. I was still that mother who showed up when called, who rearranged her schedule, who canceled her own plans so she wouldn't keep her kids waiting. The table was set with much more care than usual. That alone made me uneasy the moment I walked in. Stephanie had made a roast, opened a really good bottle of Pinot Noir, and placed taper candles in the center of the table. The fancy ones she only brought out for special occasions. It was way too nice for a simple chat. My sons-in-law stayed quiet through almost the entire meal, staring down at their plates with that hyper-focused attention of people watching a play they've already seen, knowing exactly when the lion is going to jump out. That's when Matthew put his fork down, wiped his mouth with his napkin with rehearsed calmness, and said, in a voice of someone who had practiced in the mirror, "Mom, the house has been put on the market. We already have a buyer. The contract gets signed next week." I think my body understood before my brain did. I felt my hand let go of my silverware, which made a sharp little clink against the plate. That high-pitched sound of metal on ceramic that suddenly sounded way too loud in a room where nobody else was making a sound. I looked at him, then at Stephanie. Her eyes were fixed on her wine, swirling the glass slowly as if she were studying the vintage. "What do you mean it was put on the market?" I said. "We needed to make a decision, Mom. You live alone, the house is too big, the upkeep and property taxes are expensive, and the money will make a lot more sense if it's invested." Invested by who? Silence. That specific kind of silence that lasts 2 seconds, but feels like 2 minutes. "Split among the 3 of us," Stephanie said, finally looking up at me. "It's a family asset. Dad left it for the family." I took a deep breath. There was something burning in my chest that I couldn't put a name to yet. It wasn't just anger. It was that feeling of stepping on a missing stair in the dark, when the floor vanishes beneath you without warning and your whole body reacts before your mind can process what's happening. "You didn't consult me." "We figured you were going to make it difficult," Matthew said, as if that explained everything, as if my likely disagreement was a hurdle to be bypassed rather than an opinion to be respected. Stephanie chimed in, "Mom, you don't need a house this size anymore. You're going to live in the condo we found for you. It's in a gated community with security, a fitness center, and there are other people your age for you to socialize with." Other people my age. As if I had already been placed on a shelf with a clearance tag, and it was just a matter of finding the right storage closet. "You have 1 month to get me out of my house," I said quietly. Nobody corrected me. Nobody said, "our house," or "the family house." A thick silence hung in the air, the kind that confirms everything without needing another word, the kind that speaks louder than any argument ever could. One of the sons-in-law coughed, the other poured more wine, and I just stared at that carefully set table, at those pretty candles casting shadows on the drywall, and I realized they had set a stage. They had rehearsed. That dinner was a performance, and I was the only cast member who didn't know the role I was playing. I stood up slowly. I grabbed my purse with the deliberate care of someone who refuses to give their opponent the satisfaction of seeing them shaken. I said goodnight in a voice I didn't even recognize as my own, far too steady for someone who had just been handed news like that. And I walked out without looking back. In my car, parked out front of their house with my hands gripping the steering wheel and the engine off, I sat in the dark for about 5 minutes. I wasn't crying. I was processing. I was organizing. Because there was one massive thing Matthew and Stephanie didn't know. I had found out about the sale of the house 3 weeks before that candlelit dinner. And in those 3 weeks, I hadn't just sat around waiting. Let me rewind a little, because this matters more than it seems. 3 weeks prior to that dinner, I had gone down to the county assessor's office to sort out some property tax paperwork I needed to update. It was a Monday morning. The line was short. The clerk was friendly, the kind of mundane, bureaucratic morning that shouldn't have any consequences beyond a signature and a notary stamp. While waiting in line, I started chatting with a woman who worked for a local real estate brokerage. We talked about the market, about how housing prices in the suburbs had spiked in a way even the biggest optimists hadn't seen coming, about how a lot of folks were flipping older homes to free up capital. That was when she mentioned, with zero intention of leaking a secret, that she had recently run some comps and done an appraisal on a street I knew very well. She mentioned the house number. It was my house number. She said the seller's family had asked for discretion for the time being, but everything was lined up to close soon. She dropped this bomb with the casual breeze of someone making small talk in line, completely unaware she was dropping a live grenade into someone's lap. I drove home with that information burning a hole in my pocket like a lit ember you know you shouldn't hold, but that's searing your palm anyway. I spent the entire afternoon trying to rationalize it away. Maybe it was a different house down the block. Maybe I misheard the address. Maybe the woman got her streets mixed up. But deep down, in that part of me that has been a CPA for over 3 decades and has learned that numbers rarely lie, I knew. I knew from the way my kids had been dodging me for months, from the conversations that abruptly stopped the second I walked into a room, from the probing questions about the deed they had asked me the year before under the vague guise of updating Dad's estate paperwork. I called Barbara. Barb has been my friend for 25 years. She's a real estate attorney, and she possesses that rare quality of telling you the brutal truth even when you're desperately hoping she'll lie to you. I didn't dump my suspicion on her right away. First, I asked her, in a seemingly hypothetical way, how the sale of a property registered in someone's name worked if they were left in the dark. She walked me through the legal loopholes and title transfers with the patience of someone who has explained this 1,000 times to clients who come to her after the damage is already done. And at the end of her explanation, almost as an afterthought, she said, "Maggie, the property you just described is sitting as a pocket listing at a brokerage over here. It popped up this week. I recognize the address because I've been over there for coffee 100 times. So it was real. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't an overactive imagination. It was real." I sat in my living room for a very long time after hanging up. I looked at the walls, at the framed pictures I had meticulously chosen over the years, the landscape print I bought at a farmer's market when Matthew was 10 and still thought his mom was a superhero, the family portrait taken on a Sunday afternoon when Richard was still alive and the kids were little and nobody needed lit candles to deliver terrible news. I looked at the armchair in the corner, Richard's armchair, with the worn brown leather on the armrests, which I never had the heart to throw out because the cushion still held the faint imprint of his body. I looked out the bay window at the backyard, the hydrangeas I watered twice a week, the apple tree Matthew planted from a sapling on a Saturday afternoon when he was 8, covered in dirt up to his elbows and beaming with pride. I cried a little. Just a little. It wasn't the kind of crying where you fall apart. It was the kind of crying you have to let out so your brain can clear up. Then I wiped my face, drank a glass of tap water, and called Barbara right back. "Barb, can you help me buy this house?" She went dead silent for a second that felt much longer. "Maggie, it's in your name." "I know, but I need to buy it back before they close with a stranger. It has to be through an LLC or a proxy. They cannot know it's me." Another pause. "You want to buy your own house back?" "I want to buy my house before my kids sell it to a stranger, and I want them to firmly believe they sold it to a stranger." Barbara stayed quiet for another moment. Then she took a deep breath and said, "All right. Tell me everything from the top." I had a nest egg. Decades of punching numbers, modest but highly disciplined mutual funds, a 401k, and retirement portfolio I had curated carefully over the years like someone planting a tree without rushing, knowing it takes a long time to bear fruit, but trusting the harvest will come. I never flaunted it, never lived beyond my means, never allowed myself the luxury of pretending money didn't matter. Richard used to joke that I was the only person alive who could figure out how to stash away savings while paying the water bill. I would laugh, but it was true. My entire life was built on the absolute certainty that the unexpected happens, and the only intelligent response is to be ready when it knocks on your door. I was ready. Barbara walked me through the logistics. We submitted an offer through an intermediary, a boutique holding company she occasionally used for blind trusts and discreet transactions. The offer was market rate, totally fair. I wasn't lowballing or trying to screw anyone over financially. The kids were going to get the exact payout they expected. The transaction was going to happen exactly how they drew it up. Only the buyer backing the LLC would be me. The escrow process took 2.5 weeks of back and forth, DocuSigns, wire transfers, and Zoom calls I took during my lunch breaks at the firm so I wouldn't raise any red flags at home. During that time, I kept living my day-to-day life with a sense of normalcy that cost me a massive amount of mental energy. I went to the grocery store, I watered the lawn, I took calls from Matthew and Stephanie acting like nothing was wrong, replying to their text messages with those cheerful emojis moms use when they want to seem completely oblivious. Sometimes I would stand in the hallway at night, listening to the silence of the house, that specific hum a house has when you know every creak of the floorboards, every draft that slips through the bedroom windowsill, and I'd ask myself if I was doing the right thing. But then I'd remember the candles that were inevitably coming. I'd remember the clinical precision with which they were planning to drop a bomb on my life, like they were doing me a favor. I'd remember that they had entirely stripped away my agency regarding my own home, treating me like a minor or someone who had lost their marbles and couldn't be trusted with an adult choice. I was doing the right thing. The day the closing paperwork was finalized by the proxy, I got a text from Barbara. Done. Recorded with the county. The title is permanently yours. I was sitting at my cubicle, buried deep in an end-of-month reconciliation spreadsheet, and I had to physically get up and go to the restroom so my coworkers wouldn't see the massive, uncontainable grin spreading across my face. I looked at myself in the mirror for a second. 60 years old, gray hair I had stopped dyeing a few years back because I got sick of lying to the mirror, wearing the expression of a woman who had just pulled off a long, incredibly delicate con. Well done, Maggie, I whispered to my reflection. 2 days later came the candles, the dinner, the big announcement, and I sat at their dining table, listened to the whole pitch, let my fork drop onto the plate with that sharp little clink, faked the devastation they expected, and drove home carrying a heavy secret. But heavy in a good way, the way you carry something fragile and priceless, making sure not to drop it before the time is exactly right. What happens to a 60-year-old woman when her kids decide she no longer deserves to own her own home? I asked myself that question all throughout the week that followed the dinner. I went to the office as usual, drank my morning coffee at the exact same time, read my James Patterson novel before bed. On the outside, I was regular old Maggie, the no-nonsense accountant, the reliable mom, the 60-year-old woman people pass in the aisle at Target and think, she looks like a nice grandma. But on the inside, there was a relentless running monologue, a quiet restructuring of everything I thought I knew about my children and about myself. Stephanie called me 2 days after the dinner. Her tone had that specific, syrupy cadence of someone trying to sound magnanimous while enforcing a mandate that wasn't hers to make. She told me they had locked down a beautiful apartment in a brand-new development with a clubhouse and a gym, and that I'd settle in so fast. She said she was going to personally help me pick out which pieces of furniture I should keep. She said she knew some ladies who lived in a similar complex and they just loved it. She said downsizing would be liberating. That word bounced around in my skull for days. Liberating. As if 60 years of building a life in one place was a maximum security prison I needed breaking out of. I listened to all of it with that ironclad patience you develop when you know the silence is working in your favor. I said, "That sounds nice, thank you," in a lukewarm voice she undoubtedly took as me waving the white flag. And after I hung up, I stared at my living room ceiling, thinking about how many times in life basic politeness is used as bubble wrap for a ruthless decision nobody has the guts to actually discuss. Matthew dropped by over the weekend. He brought my grandson, Tyler, 8 years old, curly hair, permanently grass-stained knees, and a level of chaotic energy that makes you realize little boys don't run on batteries. They're nuclear-powered. Matthew used the excuse of helping me start sorting through the junk. But I could see in his eyes that he was taking inventory. He scanned every room with that appraiser's stare children get when they've already moved out emotionally before moving out physically. I poured lemonade, sliced up some homemade banana bread, and let Tyler run loose in the backyard. And while Matthew paced through the house like a guy mentally slapping post-it notes on my belongings, I pretended to be completely oblivious, totally absorbed in wiping down the counters. At some point, he stopped in front of the living room bookshelf, this dark oak monstrosity Richard had built with his own 2 hands over a long Labor Day weekend. It leaned a little to the left because he had 0 patience for carpentry, but an endless supply of stubbornness. Matthew said, way too casually, "Mom, you're going to have to get rid of a lot of this stuff. The condo is a lot smaller." "I know," I said. "This bookcase, for example. It's not going to fit." "Probably not," I agreed, looking at that lopsided shelf with the strange mix of nostalgia and deep affection you can only feel for ugly things that have a good backstory. He stared at me for a solid second, clearly expecting me to crack right there, assuming that mentioning his dad's bookcase would trigger a meltdown he could use as proof that I was finally accepting reality. But I was fine. I was so fine. And that seemed to throw him off balance in a way that I secretly found incredibly telling. Tyler bounded back in from the yard, holding a hard, unripe green apple, covered in topsoil up to his elbows. I gave him a loving scolding, scrubbed his hands in the kitchen sink, and planted a long kiss on his sweaty, curly head that smelled like sunshine and cut grass. That little boy was clueless. All he knew was that Grandma's house had an apple tree. She baked killer banana bread, and it was the absolute best place on earth to play. Sometimes I felt like he was the only person left in this family who actually saw me for who I was. Over the next few days, Matthew and Stephanie took turns tagging in with visits and texts. Each deployed their own distinct brand of psychological pressure. He was direct, clinical, throwing out deadlines and checklists. She was wrapped up in toxic positivity, constantly frosting everything in a thick layer of, "We just want what's best for you." Both of them wanted me to start packing boxes immediately. They wanted me to go tour the new condo. They wanted me to sign a bunch of liability waivers and transfer documents that, according to them, were just standard moving logistics. I dragged my feet. I told them I was thinking about it. I told them I was still processing. I told them you don't dismantle 60 years of life in 2 weeks, and anyone who thinks you can has never actually lived anywhere. They've just been passing through. And all of that was true. Just not in the way they thought it was. The month ticked by the way time always moves when you're strategically waiting for something to detonate. Agonizingly slow in the first 2 weeks, when every hour drags on forever, and terrifyingly fast at the end, when you suddenly realize the trap you set is about to spring. I finally went to tour the apartment they had picked out for me. Honestly, it was beautiful. I won't lie about that. 3rd floor, overlooking a nice park, brand new kitchen with quartz countertops, that fresh paint and drywall smell that fades in a month but makes any model unit feel full of promise. The leasing agent was young, bubbly, and kept saying things like, "It's totally perfect for an independent senior, and it's right down the street from the grocery store," with the genuine enthusiasm of a kid who still believes people just need the right zip code to be happy. I gave her my best polite smile. I told her I'd think about it. Matthew called the next day to ask for my verdict. I told him it was gorgeous, but I just wasn't ready to pull the trigger. I could practically hear him rubbing his temples, frustrated with an adult mother who refused to read the script they had so carefully printed out for her. "Mom, the clock is ticking, and this unit could get snatched up by another renter any day now." "Then let them snatch it," I replied, with an airy lightness I knew would drive him insane. And it did. When I saw him next, he looked at me with a cocktail of raw frustration and something I couldn't quite place. It was almost involuntary respect, the kind you feel for a sparring partner who dodges a punch you were sure was going to land, forcing you to recalculate. The truth is, during that 30-day countdown, I took care of a few very quiet, very crucial things. Number 1. I had a sit-down with the attorney to guarantee, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the title was bulletproof. Every deed was clean, the public record was updated, every signature was exactly where the state of Ohio demanded it be. The house was mine in the most absolute, legally binding way possible. There was zero margin for legal pushback. Number 2, I wrote a letter, not to mail to anyone. Just to write it, because over the years I've learned that some things only become real once you put a pen to paper, when they stop looping around in your skull and take on actual shape, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I wrote it to Richard, which I still do sometimes when I need to untangle my brain in a way that only works when I'm talking to a very specific ghost. There is something about the act of writing to someone, even someone who can never read it, that organizes your soul in a way no living therapist ever could. I wrote down everything. The candlelit ambush, the 30-day eviction notice handed to me like I was a bad roommate in my own life, the LLC proxy purchase, the weeks I spent playing dumb. I wrote about Barb and her legal maneuvering, the stacks of documents, the patronizing check-ins from Matthew and Stephanie where I didn't break character once. And at the bottom of the page, I wrote a sentence that genuinely shocked me when I read it back, because it wasn't what I thought I felt. I'm not angry with them, I'm heartbroken, and there is a massive difference between the two. Anger is hot, it's instant, it has momentum, it takes up space and makes noise. Heartbreak is colder, heavier, brutally honest. When you're furious with someone, you're still deeply tethered to them. Anger is just love flipped inside out because you still care so damn much. When you're heartbroken, you've realized the distance between you is real. That something you believe to be true simply isn't, and that gap isn't temporary. It doesn't magically vanish with an "I'm sorry" or a hug. It takes real architecture to rebuild. Number 3, I decided I wasn't going to drop the bomb before the deadline expired. I wanted that exact, specific moment when Matthew or Stephanie finally showed up to collect with the exhausted patience of a parent waiting for a toddler to realize playtime is over. And I could finally give them my real answer. That day arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Day 30. Matthew drove over in person, unannounced, which told me he was there to close the deal and rip the Band-Aid off. He knocked on the door with the posture of an executive who already has the meeting minutes typed up in his head. I let him in. I poured him a cup of drip coffee. We sat at the kitchen island, the exact same kitchen where he had inhaled hundreds of slices of banana bread, where I made him chicken noodle soup when he had the flu, where Richard used to read the Sunday paper while the smell of pancakes filled the house. "Mom, the deadline is today." I am well aware. The apartment we looked at got rented out to someone else. But there's another one, slightly bigger, a couple of towns over. I need a hard yes or no today. "I have an answer for you," I said, with a bone-deep calm that took me months to manufacture. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the counter, ready to solve a logic puzzle. "I'm not going anywhere." The coffee went cold between us as that sentence hung in the stale kitchen air, expanding to fill the entire room. There are very few times in life when you get to watch a human being mentally reboot in real time. It is a fascinating and slightly cruel thing to witness. Matthew's eyes literally glitched out in front of me, like someone pulled his power cord and plugged him back in. I watched the utter confusion wash over his face, then the disbelief, followed by a frantic, high-speed calculation as his brain tried to wedge those 4 words into a reality that made sense to him. "You're not going anywhere," he echoed, testing the syllables in his mouth like sour milk. "No, because I bought this house, Matthew, through an LLC. The closing docs are signed, the deed is recorded, and the title is clear. Legally, this house belongs to me. I bought it from you." He froze, for a span of time that felt significantly longer than it actually was. The wall clock, the tacky wooden one that had been hanging there since the 90s, the one Matthew and Stephanie used to time their homework races against each other, ticked with a rhythmic thud that sounded like a bass drum. "That's literally impossible," he finally choked out. You don't have that kind of cash. That sentence right there. That specific sentence. It's a wild thing, the frozen snapshot children keep of their parents, a mental Polaroid taken somewhere around middle school, where mom and dad are just these anxious figures constantly telling them to turn the lights off to save electricity, patching up scraped knees, and aggressively balancing a checkbook at the dining table. It never dawned on them that decades of grueling work, disciplined index funds, and a lifetime of skipping luxury vacations built a financial bedrock that you can't see from the street, quietly compounding until the day it's needed. I absolutely do, I said. I have that, and then some. I always have, Matthew. You guys just never bothered to ask. That last part was the kill shot. Not the money, the never bothered to ask. Why the hell wouldn't you tell us? I just looked at him. It was the wrong question, and I knew he was going to realize it the second it left his mouth. The right question wasn't why didn't you tell us? It was why didn't we ask? And the gap between those two questions says everything about how they viewed me. Not as a human being with an inner life worth knowing, but as a liability that needed managing. Matthew, you sat me down at a beautifully set table, poured me a glass of wine, informed me you had sold my home out from under me, slapped a 30-day eviction notice on my plate like I was an unwanted squatter, and drove home fully expecting me to politely pack my boxes and vanish. In what universe was I supposed to bust out my financial portfolio for you? He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and nothing came out. You let me believe, or at least you pretended to believe, that I was going to be out on the street, that a 60-year-old widow was going to have to scramble to find a roof over her head like she was broke. We didn't think you'd be on the street. We had an apartment lined up, that you picked out for me, without asking me if I wanted to live there, without asking me a damn thing, Matthew. That is the entire point. He stood up slowly, looking like a man who has no idea where the exit is, but knows he can't stay seated. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring down the long hallway as if he was seeing the ghosts of the last 30 years lined up against the drywall. Then he looked back at me with an expression I couldn't easily pin down. There was fury, there was deep embarrassment, and somewhere underneath that, I couldn't tell if it was remorse or just pure shock. You didn't have to play it like this, Mom. I actually took a second to think before responding. Not a defensive reflex. A real thought. You guys didn't have to play it the way you did either. But you did. He walked out. He didn't slam the front door, and that, for some reason I couldn't articulate at the time, felt way more significant than if he had. Stephanie called 2 hours later. I didn't even have to hold the phone to my ear to know the vibe. She came out swinging with, "How could you do this to your own family?" And I just let her vent, because I knew she had to burn through the hysteria before we could get to the actual meat of the conversation. When she finally ran out of oxygen, I said very calmly, "Steph, I love both of you, but being your mother doesn't obligate me to be treated like a passenger in my own life." She called me a drama queen. I told her that was fine. Everyone copes with reality the best way they can. She told me this was going to destroy the family. I told her the family was broken a long time before today. I was just the only one wearing my glasses. She hung up on me. I sat at the kitchen island for a long time. The coffee pot was still on, burnt and cold. Outside, the yard was soaking in that heavy orange late afternoon glow, that specific golden hour light right before the sun dips below the horizon, when it feels like the whole world is taking a deep breath before clocking out for the night. I dialed Barbara's number. "It's done," I said when she picked up. "All of it." She paused for a beat and then said, in that gravelly, no BS voice of hers, "It's about damn time, Maggie. It's about damn time." What comes after a blowout like that is, without fail, harder than the blowout itself. When you're executing a master plan, adrenaline keeps you propped up. The secret you're holding, the finish line you're sprinting toward, the sheer momentum of outsmarting the people trying to corner you. It's stressful, but it's fuel. The problem is the hangover. The hangover is waking up on a quiet Thursday morning, The house unconditionally yours, no deadlines looming, no schemes to run, and having to figure out what the hell to do with the emotional wreckage that a deed of trust and a notary stamp can't fix. The next few weeks were thick with radio silence. Matthew didn't call. Stephanie shot me a clipped text saying she needed space to process. I texted back saying I needed the exact same thing and that a timeout was probably best for everyone. Both of those statements were true. I kept going to the office. I ran my spreadsheets, filed client taxes, drank my Keurig coffee at 8 a.m. sharp. But internally, the monologue kept looping, the kind of internal debate you have when you don't know where to put your disappointment. Not anger, which has a target and a velocity. Disappointment, which is like fog. It's heavy, it's everywhere, and you can't punch it, because there is a massive gulf between being right and being okay. I was right. I did what I had to do. I protected my assets. I refused to be written out of my own script. But that didn't mean I was okay. That gaping hole left by my kid's betrayal didn't magically sew itself shut just because the real estate transaction was finalized. What kept me up at night more than anything was Tyler. My 8-year-old grandson with the messy curls and the green apples. He had zero collateral guilt in any of this. All he knew was that Grandma baked cookies and had an awesome backyard. And now, depending on how radioactive Matthew decided to make things, I might be cut off from him. That specific threat hurt worse than anything else. It wasn't anger or pride. It was the preemptive grief of a loss that hasn't happened yet, but you can already smell it coming, like ozone right before a thunderstorm. And it was thinking about Tyler, about that sweet kid who just wanted to climb trees and eat sugar, that forced me to realize something critical. I did not want this to turn into a Cold War. I refused to spend the final quarter of my life dug into a trench, treating my own children like enemy combatants, negotiating visits like hostage drop-offs, heavily redacting my sentences so nobody could use my words as ammo. That would be a catastrophic waste of the time I have left. And if 60 years on Earth has taught me anything, it's that the clock is ticking, even for people who think they have all the time in the world. I wanted things to change, a structural, permanent shift. I didn't want to go back to normal, because the old normal was a toxic illusion built on a foundation of suppressed boundaries that was always destined to collapse. I wanted something more authentic. I wanted all the cards face up on the table. On a Saturday morning, I was out back hitting the flower beds with the hose when I heard the wrought iron side gate swing open. It makes this atrocious screeching noise ever since Richard installed it. A squeak I never WD-40'd because I secretly love the built-in alarm system. I looked up and saw Matthew standing there, looking like a guy who knows he's trespassing but can't bring himself to leave. I didn't say a word, just kept spraying the dirt. He stood there for a solid minute, staring at the yard with a look I couldn't quite decipher from 20 feet away. "Those were Dad's favorites," he finally said, nodding toward the hydrangea bushes that were popping with blue blooms that week. "They were," I agreed, not turning off the water. We let the silence sit there. It wasn't a hostile silence. It was an old, worn-in silence, the kind that exists between two people who share a lot of mileage and are desperately searching for the jumper cables to restart the engine. "I screwed up, Mom." I lowered the hose. "You did," I agreed. "It wasn't just the house. It was the execution. It was going behind your back. It was the sheer arrogance of thinking I was entitled to manage your life." "Yes." He finally made direct eye contact. He had deep, dark bags under his eyes. The guy looked like he hadn't slept a full 8 hours in a month, like he had spent his nights aggressively trying to balance a spreadsheet that kept returning an error code. "Are you going to let me try to fix this?" I stood there, hose dripping onto the grass, and actually ran the math before answering. I didn't give the default TV mom response, where all is instantly forgiven because that's the cultural expectation. I thought about it deeply, standing right there in the yard. "I don't know yet," I told him. "But the fact that you drove over here counts for something." He nodded slowly. He hung around the yard a bit longer. We made small talk about Tyler, who was apparently begging to come over. We talked about the apple tree, which desperately needed a pruning. We talked about absolutely nothing of consequence, the kind of low-stakes chatter that doesn't fix a damn thing on its own, but lays a single brick of mortar if you keep showing up to do it. When he eventually walked back to his SUV, he looked a few pounds lighter than when he walked in. I latched the iron gate, walked back inside, sank into Richard's beat-up leather recliner, and just listened to the hum of the refrigerator. "You see that?" I whispered to the empty room. "The apple tree is still standing." Stephanie took longer to break, which was exactly what I expected, because Stephanie has always been a slow burn. She needs a wide runway to land the plane, but when she finally touches down, she hits emotional depths Matthew isn't built for. Matthew is a fixer. He identifies the glitch and writes the code to patch it. Stephanie operates in the abstract. She has to wade through a swamp of her own defensive mechanisms before she can find solid ground. It was almost 3 weeks before she finally surfaced. She pulled into the driveway on a random Tuesday afternoon, totally unannounced, which was wildly out of character for a woman who sends calendar invites for Sunday brunch. She was holding a lemon meringue pie, my absolute favorite, baked from scratch, which I knew instantly because the crust looked rustic and not out of a cardboard box. That pie was a white flag of surrender, plain and simple. We sat in the living room. I ate a slice slowly, deliberately, not rushing the sugar high. She sat on the sofa, her eyes darting around the room, taking inventory of the walls, the family photos, the leaning bookcase, like someone checking a mental map to make sure the topography hadn't shifted. "You didn't remodel anything," she noted. "Why would I?" She gave a tiny, self-deprecating shake of her head. "I assumed you were going to gut the place, to mark your territory, prove a point." "I didn't need to mark my territory. The deed does that for me." She let out a short, genuine, slightly bitter laugh, the kind that only slips out when you drop the PR spin and just surrender to the absurdity of it all. "You really blindsided us, Mom. You guys threw the first punch." "I know." She set her fork down on the coffee table. "We convinced ourselves we were doing the merciful thing. We told ourselves that once you saw the high-end finishes in the condo, you'd be thrilled. That it was the smart, pragmatic move. We engineered this whole narrative in our heads, that you were rattling around in a house that was too big, that we were protecting your golden years. But we were just writing the script we needed to justify what we wanted to do." I kept my mouth shut, letting her dig. "Mom, the difference between doing what you assume is best for someone and actually doing what is best for them is one step. You ask them, and we never asked. Not once. We hijacked your autonomy like you were a teenager or like you had dementia and couldn't be trusted with a checkbook." It was the first time she had stripped off the bubble wrap and just stated the ugly facts out loud. I felt the weight of it. "And the part that stings the most," I told her, matching her tone, "isn't the real estate listing. It's the realization that my own children looked at me and concluded, she doesn't need to know. She's not going to get it. It's just easier if we bypass her. That is the scar tissue." Stephanie's eyes welled up. She's exactly like her dad in that regard. The waterworks hit fast and hard, without warning. That's not exactly how we rationalized it. "Then enlighten me." She took a ragged breath. When she finally spoke, the corporate manager cadence was gone. She just sounded exhausted. "David and I were drowning in debt from a startup venture that tanked. Matthew took a bath on some crypto investments. The equity in this house was a life raft, and we took the path of least resistance. We lied to ourselves, saying this was a win-win for you, when really, it was just a bailout for us. We dressed up our panic as concern for your well-being so we could sleep at night." That confession landed on the coffee table like a lead weight, entirely different from anything we had discussed before. When the raw, unvarnished truth gets dropped in your lap like that, you never quite know what to do with your hands. I could have gone nuclear, and a tiny petty part of me wanted to. I could have flooded with relief that the mystery was solved, and a larger part of me did. But the dominant emotion was something far more complex than anger or vindication. It was the profound realization that the exact conversation we desperately needed to have was finally happening. "Thank you for having the guts to say that out loud," I told her. She wiped her mascara with the back of her hand. "Thank you for not changing the locks." We sat in silence for a while, eating pie. Outside, the suburban Ohio afternoon was perfectly still, the hydrangeas swaying slightly in the breeze, the old apple tree standing there with the stubborn permanence of something that put its roots down a long time ago and refuses to apologize for taking up space. We didn't magically resolve years of dysfunction that Tuesday. I didn't grant her blanket amnesty, as if forgiveness is a light switch you just flip on. Forgiveness is a lot more like landscaping. You have to till the soil, plant the seeds, water the dirt, and then you have to possess the agonizing patience to let it grow on its own schedule. But the tectonic plates shifted that afternoon. The massive crater between us shrank just a fraction of an inch. It didn't close. It was still there, demanding a lot of manual labor. But it got smaller, and sometimes getting smaller is the only way to start. Richard had a saying he used to repeat whenever I was spiraling over a problem that felt unsolvable. He'd say it in that steady baritone voice of his that never wavered, even in a crisis. "Maggie, anything worth keeping has deep roots, and roots take a damn long time to grow." He applied that logic to everything, to the apple tree that took 3 brutal winters before yielding a single piece of fruit, to the backyard landscaping that took an entire spring to stop looking like a mud pit, to our blowout marital fights that sometimes took 3 days to thaw but always left the marriage stronger on the other side. Roots take time. He wrote that on the back of a utility envelope one Sunday afternoon, and I tossed it in the back of my desk drawer. To this day, when I dig around for a stamp, I find that envelope with his messy handwriting that always slanted a little too far to the right. I'm telling you this story a few months removed from the candlelit ambush, the 30-day notice, the LLC proxy stunt, and the fallout. I'm not telling it because everything is neatly tied up with a bow like a Hallmark movie. It's not. I'm telling it because it feels necessary to document the reality of the aftermath. The title is mine. Unapologetically, legally, permanently. I bought it back because it was the right move. The only move that guaranteed the one thing I was always entitled to, the right to dictate my own footprint on this earth. It wasn't a revenge plot. It wasn't a malicious flex to prove a point. It was a barricade. It was the loudest, most concrete way I could scream into the void. I am still here. I am the captain of this ship, and the credits don't roll until I say they do. Matthew swings by now and then. He brings Tyler, who is still violently yanking green apples off the branches way too early and sprinting through the kitchen tracking mud everywhere, completely ignorant to the concept of consequences. Those visits still have a weird, crackling static to them, like when you rearrange the living room furniture. The new feng shui makes logical sense. It's objectively better, but you still keep bumping your hip on the coffee table out of muscle memory. We are learning how to be adults together. It's clunky, it's occasionally painful, but sometimes, like when Tyler wipes out in the grass and Matthew laughs that deep, booming laugh he's had since junior high, it's actually kind of beautiful. Stephanie is a work in progress, as her therapist calls it. She and David are digging themselves out of their financial hole the hard way, without asking me to co-sign a loan, which earns my respect more than I could ever articulate. Not because I'm stingy, but because true rehabilitation only sticks when you climb out of the ditch using your own fingernails. I am here if the wheels completely fall off, but I don't volunteer a life jacket until someone yells, "Man overboard," because jumping in uninvited would just be me replicating their exact mistake in reverse. We text more often now, tiptoeing around each other with a fragile politeness that never existed before. It's delicate, like a sapling that just got repotted in strange soil. I'm letting it bake in the sun, because forcing a plant to grow usually just snaps the stem. I had a random visitor a few weeks ago. An old friend of Stephanie's I hadn't seen in a decade knocked on the front door just to say hi because she was driving through town. We sat on the back deck drinking iced tea for 2 hours. She knew absolutely zero context about the real estate drama, the proxy buyer, or the Cold War with my kids. She was just there. And sitting out there, gossiping about HOA drama and Netflix shows that had nothing to do with escrows or betrayal, I realized how violently I had starved myself of that exact feeling. The feeling of just existing. Unplugged from the matrix of family management, I started prioritizing that. I dragged Barb out to Panera Bread for coffee on a random Tuesday. I re-enrolled in a pottery class at the community center that I dropped years ago because I never had the bandwidth. I go for aggressive power walks around the neighborhood, not to burn calories, but just to listen to the neighbors' wind chimes before going back inside. Minuscule things. But you stack enough minuscule things together, and suddenly you have a life. I had benched myself for way too long. As for me, the biggest takeaway from this entire circus wasn't the legal victory or the power dynamic shift. It was the brutal realization that turning 60 doesn't mean you've graduated from growing pains. It just means you've reached the boss level where the heavy illusions finally burn off. The illusion that the people who share your DNA will automatically treat you with the reverence you've earned. The illusion that endless sacrifice guarantees a return on investment. The illusion that family is synonymous with safe harbor. When the smoke clears, what you're left with is the raw, exposed studs of your life. You see exactly who people are and exactly who you are when the drywall comes down. I've always been a caretaker. It was so hardwired into my motherboard that I fundamentally forgot I was legally allowed to be taken care of too. Or, at the bare minimum, consulted. Or treated like a woman whose 3 decades of grinding out tax returns and making hard choices actually meant something. Not just as a mom, not just as grandma, but as a grown-ass woman with agency. That candlelit dinner was, in a wildly twisted and agonizing way, the best gift I never asked for. It forced my hand. It forced me to stop smiling through the disrespect. It held a mirror up to my face and demanded I answer a question I had been dodging for a decade. At what specific milestone did I casually accept being treated like an NPC in the lives of the people I loved most? The truth was an ugly pill to swallow. I started accepting it the minute I confused unconditional love with a total lack of boundaries, when I decided that my comfort was the acceptable collateral damage to keep the peace. When I quietly signed off on the idea that my opinion regarding my own zip code was a mere formality that could be skipped to save time. Signing those LLC papers was the ultimate hard reset. It wasn't a dramatic reality TV table flip. It wasn't a flex to prove I'm a shark. It was a stone-cold statement of fact. I am here. I run this board. My finale gets written by me. Just the other morning, I was sitting out on the back patio, the one Stephanie used to dramatically call the edge of the earth, when she was an angsty teen because it faced the deep woods behind the property, when my iPhone buzzed. It was Tyler, FaceTiming me from his dad's phone, completely losing his mind because he won a goldfish at the elementary school spring carnival. He spent 5 solid minutes giving me a microscopic breakdown of this fish's anatomy. It was orange, it had white spots, it had a weird fin, and he had named it some garbled mashup of a Marvel superhero and a Pokemon. He was hyperventilating with joy, just desperately needing to download this breaking news to someone who would actually care. I sat there, the coffee going lukewarm in my mug, just listening to this tiny human rant about a spotted goldfish. He didn't need anything from me. He didn't need my money, my advice, or my real estate. He just needed a voice on the other end of the line to say, "No way, dude," at the exact right moment to give him my undivided, uncompromised attention. And it hit me. This is why you fight like hell to keep your footing. Not to prove you're the smartest person in the room. Not to win a power struggle. Not to flex on people who underestimated your checking account. You plant your feet so you can still be the voice on the other end of the phone when someone you love genuinely needs you to listen. The apple tree is still standing. Richard's hydrangeas are still blooming. That horribly lopsided leather recliner is still wedged in the corner of the living room, exactly where it's always been. And I am right here in my house, exactly where I belong, 60 years old, carrying a lot of history, wearing scars I refuse to cover up with concealer, anchored by deep roots that took a lifetime to grow but are finally holding firm. Roots take time. Richard was dead right. Now, if you enjoyed this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the comments below. Which plot twist made your jaw drop? Oh, and don't forget to become a channel member to unlock exclusive bonus content I don't post anywhere else. See you in the next one.